we're now speaking of the legal process that would be required to replace a presidential nominee at this stage. We should say a presumptive nominee because the candidates have not formally been nominated yet. And a big part of the argument here is, do you put your trust in the voters? Don't forget, primaries were contested, right? And so the voters did speak on both sides, Democratic side and the Republican side, and there are nominees, right? So if you were to replace them at this stage, you would, on a certain level, be undermining the will of the voters,
Absolutely.
right? So for those unaware, the president sent a letter to Congress saying that he is not going to step down. And he called for the calls for him to step down to end. And he raised that same point that we have to listen to the voters in the democratic process. We had primary,
Right.
and we now have our candidates. So the calls have not stopped, right? We can debate whether they should, whether we should even be having this conversation at this point. But I did want to explain a bit of the legal process that this would all entail, because I think some people are not clear about it. They think that you can just willy-nilly replace a candidate, and it's not quite that simple.
Right. I think that's another point that's not being talked about a lot as well, the replacing the candidate, basically subverting the will of the people. Because like you said, these were contested
Yeah,
primaries. People voted and
Mhm.
overwhelmingly voted
yeah.
for
Yeah.
Biden. I think we talked about one. It was like 78% or something like that in one race.
Not only that, but even when he wasn't on the ballot in the state,
Right.
Right.
they wrote him in and he won overwhelmingly.
Mhm.
Yeah, and he just dominated. So I think that's not talked about enough. Um, his concerns about his health and his capacity, I think are valid, but this at this stage, replacing him would be a disaster. Um, and he's got a team around him. It's not just him. I think I saw
Mhm.
someone post something before, or remember when you're voting, you're not just voting for a person, you're voting for a whole administration as well. And this administration has a good track record, right? They are getting the job done. I mean, a lot of things that they're doing is really good. So this is just a distraction talking about, replacing the candidate and this and that. And really, it's a failure on the part of Democrats and liberals to even uh, have this discussion in the
Right.
public at this point.
So
Mhm.
yeah. Wow. So yeah. So a few different points on that. Number one, I think you hit it on the head. So much of this divide that we're seeing now over Biden, I think, is really about the Democratic Party being divided. And there are people in the
Mhm.
party who didn't like him in the first place and who are almost gleeful now at this idea that he could be too old and too feeble to beat Trump. And it's kind of disgusting in the sense that these are self-described Democrats or liberal voters who,
Mhm.
right, say that they wouldn't want another Trump term, but they kind of do because it
Right.
gives them satisfaction in thinking that Biden wasn't strong enough to get it done. I think a lot of these voters are the ones who wanted Bernie to be the nominee and
Mhm.
didn't get that, right? And so what
Right.
happened when Biden ran in 2020? All of them said he can't win, he can't beat Trump, he's too old. He's, even though Bernie's up there, I don't know why they picked on Biden's age, but nonetheless, they would say he's too old and feeble to do it, and really too moderate for them, whatever the case may be. But when he won, as much as they were happy, I think, to see Trump lose, I think a lot of them are still kind of bitter about the fact that it was Biden who beat Trump and not Bernie. And so the refrain immediately became, well, he can't do it again. I bet you he can't do it twice. Just wait. And so it's like they're giggling now with this idea that
Mhm.
he could possibly lose. And they're really feeding this. And I really think that's the major driving point behind the numbers being what they are, behind the conversation being what it is. It's the Democratic Party being divided. We talk about the Republicans, they have their quabbles, whatever. They come home, they rally behind their candidate at the end of the day, right?
Right.
Democrats aren't doing that. In 2016, too many of them didn't like Hillary. and voted for Jill Stein, a third party, whatever they did, and we got what we got. So
Well, they remember it's not just the Bernie Bros and whatnot. It's part of in the Democratic Party period. Like remember in it was Obama's second term. Like a lot of Democrats
Mhm.
started to jump ship when they sensed a few troubles.
right, right, it's the purity
Yeah.
test.
It's like they're looking at specific points instead of like the whole picture,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean,
Mhm.
Trump 34 felony convictions. He got
yes,
the civil suit
yes,
were sexual,
Right.
related issues. He's mentioned in the Epstein files multiple times, I think more than anyone else.
right. Accused
And
of rape actually in a lawsuit relating to Epstein.
right, and
Mhm.
they're not abandoning him. They're
Right, and
still
Right.
full
isn't
behind him.
Well,
that a sad state of the country though, that one candidate is being talked about as if he should step down even after the voters overwhelmingly nominated him. The other candidate
mhm.
doesn't really get that. I know some people now are trying to give that back, but that's really not the conversation.
Right.
Mhm.
You would think if you were to ask someone, who would the country be overwhelmingly talking about stepping down? The one who was convicted of 34 felonies or the one who sounded a little old at that one debate performance? I mean, most people I think would say, of course, the guy 34 felonies, obviously, you know, right? But
You would
that's not the
think.
conversation we're having.
Right. You would think that would be the
Yeah,
case, right?
yeah,
All right.
And
But you have to look at how Trump, what is happening with Trump. And before the court, he went to on trial. The perception from the beginning was that he is being picked at.
right,
So every time when he went out there to rally his constituents, it was like, look what they're saying about me. Look what they're doing about to
right,
me.
right.
And
that's a
they're like,
narrative.
yeah,
That's a
they're
narrative
doing this
he's pushing, though. We got to be
right,
clear.
but
It's not that it's what the world thinks. It's a narrative he's pushing, and his followers
right,
are following in suit.
Yeah,
right. And see that's what's rallying them. On top of the high prices, it's a lot that's good that's playing into that. So it makes him look favorable.
but
And
To
when
some,
you
people are just so used to him saying what he says and doing what he does that there's a
uh-huh,
numbness to it, right? And so when the fact checkers come out and say he lied 30 times at the debate, that's not even being part of the narrative. Like people are saying, yeah, that's just what he does. Like no one is saying he should step down for lying 30 times. It's like, no,
right,
he's gonna lie every day. We know that. So it's like it seems
but
like
it's like, oh,
it creates this double standard, right? With this pressure on one
right,
side to be perfect, and then on the other side, they can do whatever they want, and no one ever checks them on it. Or if they do, it's kind of like it's shrugged off.
right.
yeah,
And the
but still
media
at the
is
end of
really. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say at the end of the day, his constituents still feel that you're trying to find fault in him,
Right,
regardless of what he does. And that's how the conversation started.
Right.
And this is how
right.
it's ended.
Yeah, and the
So
media is really feeding into it. There was that piece in the New York Times calling for Biden to step down, and people are like, "Wait a minute! They never wrote a piece calling for the person with 34 felonies to step down for the good of the country." Like, it's like even the media that's either supposed to be middle of the road or so-called liberal or whatnot, they're feeding into this frenzy for shock value, for clicks, for
right.
Uh-huh.
For the horse race,
um
think of the horse race. They want to make it
sensationalism, etc.
exciting.
Huh?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Right, and it's
Right.
doing a great disservice to the country. The other
Yes,
thing
absolutely.
I would just mention is all of this is distracting us from discussions on policy. We're not speaking of what kind of policy do we want going forward? What kind of country do we want to live in? What kind of country do we want our kids and grandkids to grow up in? Who do we want
Right.
to be on the Supreme Court, right? What do we think about all of these issues? Isn't it pretty embarrassing for us as a country right now, regardless of which side you're on politically? Just this idea that no one is even having a debate at the moment on policy. It's all about
Yeah.
personality. And I mean, it's just crazy to me. If you're a voter, let's say you're a middle of the road voter, you're going to change your mind, from one candidate to the other based on their speech pattern, or if you think they have more energy than the other, and just completely disregard the fact that they're often diametrically opposed on major policy points. I mean, shouldn't that be a little bit more important to you?
Right,
Well,
absolutely. I mean,
it should, yeah. Mhm.
I think it's entering the conversation a little bit, but and that's with this interest now in Project 2025. It's starting, some of it is creeping in, but we got to remember this is with Trump. He's never given any sort of policy. Even in his first
Yeah.
election, he never specified any policy the whole time and still skated through. So,
Right. It's a personality. It's not about policy.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
but
the thing is this, and you have a track record of 4 years. So it's not like some
Right.
grand mystery. What's he going to try to do when in office? I mean, he's, for example, bragging about overturning Roe v. Wade. That's a major point of contention. That should weigh on your mind, I would think, a little bit more
yes,
than the age of the candidates and how they walk down the steps.
right,
Right.
yeah.
So, all right, but I think we got a little bit off track. I mean, I did want to have that discussion, but the main point of this is to talk about the legal process because that is the conversation. So, while that conversation is going on in the country, I do want to talk about legally what would have to happen and what the deadlines are. It's a lot sooner than people think, right? Now, I know most people understand that the conventions haven't happened yet, and so officially there's no nominee on either side. That's why we say presumptive nominee. Both of them have enough delegates that they've amassed through the primary process to win the nomination, right? They're each going to win their nomination right now, but it hasn't been made official. And so, yes, legally speaking, we don't have a nominee of either party. So legally, it is possible, right? Then the realm of possibility to replace the candidates. But how would that happen, right? So there's actually a wrinkle thrown in this. Normally, it legally, formally is written in stone, right? It's decided concretely at the conventions. This year, a little bit different perhaps because of a new law in Ohio. Now, Ohio is requiring their ballot to be finalized by August. Let me pull up this date here. It's the beginning of August. I believe it's August 7th. You have that up, Jay? I know I had it in this article.
Or
Ohio's ballot deadline. Yes, I hear it. August 7th. Okay, so the Democratic convention is scheduled for August 19th through the 22nd. And so this idea that they're going to go to the convention and the delegates are going to possibly nominate somebody else, well, they really can't do that unless they're just going to bypass Ohio because they have to formally make their nomination prior to August 7th in order to have their nominee in place for that Ohio deadline. And so what they're talking about doing now is having a virtual convention prior to August 7th to be able to nominate somebody. They're saying that it's going to be in July, this month, possibly the last week of the month, or maybe even before that, where the delegates are going to meet virtually to make the formal nomination so that they can have that decision in time for the Ohio deadline. Because if they don't do that, then their nominee won't be on the ballot in Ohio. We know Ohio has historically been a swing state that decides the elections. More recently, it's leaning red, right? It's leaning more Republican presidential races. And so it is likely going to be a Trump state, probably. So there is talk of, well, maybe you just forego Ohio if you're the Democrat. Just say, listen, we're just going to give up Ohio and not put someone on the ballot there. The problem with that is that doesn't just hurt the presidential ticket, it hurts all of the races in Ohio because you get a much bigger turnout by having a presidential nominee at the top of your ticket, right? Presidential years, you see all these local races have huge spikes in turnout because people are coming to vote for president. So, for example, the candidates running for Senate in Ohio, their race is going to be greatly affected by the top of the ticket, by the presidential nominees. And so if you don't put Biden, let's say, on the Ohio ballot, then you also are going to hurt the Senate candidate and all the other candidates running in Ohio. So they don't want to do that, right? And so realistically, this means that they are going to have to decide their nominee really this month. I would say by the end of the month at the latest.
Right.
They probably have 2 weeks to do it. I would say 2 weeks is probably as long as they have to make up their mind because the Ohio ballot has to be set. And given that Biden just wrote that letter to Congress saying he's not stepping down, I honestly don't see it happening in the next 2 weeks. I don't think that's really going to happen. There's the talk of, okay, well, what if he doesn't voluntarily step down? What if he's defiant and he says, I'm going to run, but the party wants to replace him anyway? What then, right?
Right.
In that case, you have the delegates, and again, these are pledged delegates to Biden, right? He's got a majority. They have to vote. Can they defy their pledge, right? Can they say, even though we're pledged to Biden, we're going to vote for another candidate? Well, the Democratic Party rules kind of prohibit that, but there is some wiggle room there. They are supposed to, in good faith, represent the will of the voters who sent them. So that means that by default, yes, they are supposed to vote for that candidate. However, they can make the argument that we can't in good faith do that, right? When the voters voted, yes, they were voting in good faith for this candidate at that time, but circumstances have changed, and we think to represent the will of these people today, we have to go in another direction. They could try to make that argument. There's some wiggle room there, but honestly, that's very unlikely, and that would be debated and discussed, and that's not the most realistic scenario here, right? The most realistic scenario is these delegates are pledged to Biden, they're going to vote for Biden, unless Biden himself says, I'm not running, and in that case, he can kind of weigh in on it and say who he thinks they should go with, but they wouldn't have to anymore. At that point, they can vote for whoever they want, and it could get interesting, but that's only in the scenario where he himself says no in the next 2 weeks, which doesn't seem likely to me at this point, right? If he is still in, realistically speaking, though not technically impossible, it seems way out the realm of likely that he will be replaced.
Right. I think it would be, it's kind of late in the game. If they want, I think they would definitely guarantee a lost election if they were to do that now. First of all, you've got a candidate that doesn't have the same track record that they're going to put forward. Democrats don't really have a replacement candidate for Biden, really. At the same time, people who voted for Biden in the primary would feel slighted and be upset in that regard as well. It would just be a disaster, I think.
I mean, some are saying that it's a guaranteed loss if you keep them, right? You're saying it's a guaranteed loss if you replace them. But here's the else I think that's related to your point there. It isn't only a matter of establishing a track record. We know the power of incumbency is substantial. It's also a matter of campaign money, right? People disregard that. The $100 million that Biden has, he wouldn't be allowed to just give it to Harris or another nominee. They would have to raise that money from scratch. That's not easy. To raise $100 million in a couple of weeks.
Right. In a couple,
yeah.
I did see
because they want to hit the ground running. They would need some funds and they'd have zero.
So what happens now? I did see where some of the wealthy Democrats said if he did not pull out, I think I saw that a couple of days ago, they were no longer going to fund the Democratic Party.
Okay. I mean, there are some who have very strong opinions on it.
So what happens in that case? Will he still have the funds to proceed to stay in the race?
You just wouldn't get those particular people's money. But you also have to realize that, so a lot of people now, I saw a congressperson earlier say he should step down. And, a lot of people making noise about this. Once the dust settles on this, I think a lot of people are going to have to start changing their tune, right? Because it's going to have to be a choice. It's a binary choice at that point, right? Now there's this, it could be anyone in the world. Who the hell knows? Well, the Messiah himself or herself will emerge and come on. The one that doesn't happen, then it's all right. This is who we got. We got this person. We got this person. Who are you with, right? And I think the dialogue you have to change at that point.
Yeah, I think we're at that point though. It's basically been a binary choice since the end of the primaries. Like there's, I know people are like, well, RFK, but he's got no shot. Cornel West is not even a thought. Jill Stein, as much as I like, what there's a lot of stuff she says, she's got no chance.
Right.
It's a binary choice, regardless, of what happened. So
now some people are asking about the superdelegates. Remember the whole conversation about superdelegates to the convention? These are delegates who aren't pledged to any particular candidate. They can go in and just do whatever. So people saying, well, what about them? Can they tip the scale? There were actually reforms made to the DNC rules, right? Democratic Party rules, where superdelegates now don't have any say unless there is no majority, unless no candidate has a majority of pledged delegates, right? So they basically only come in to be tiebreakers at this point. If a candidate, and Biden has, I think, over 90% of the pledged delegates. So if a candidate has a majority of those, superdelegates can't do anything. Of course, if Biden were to say, I'm no longer running, then those superdelegates and all the delegates can come in and do it whatever they wish. But if that doesn't happen, right, if he holds on to his pledged delegates, there really isn't a path forward to replace him. You know, like I said, only wiggle room is if some of those delegates stand up. But do you really think more than half of them are going to do that? Half of his pledged delegates are going to stand up and say, even though the party rules say you have to in good faith represent the will of the voters, we're saying that in this scenario, the will of the voters in our states has changed.
Right.
And, you know, to the point where we're no longer going to stick by the person we were elected to support here. You know, I think you might have a couple people doing that. I don't see most of them taking that route.
Yeah.
Even if they tried that, I think that would open the door to discussion and debate as to whether that's even allowed. Right?
Yeah.
So, like I said, I really think it's a bit of a pipe dream, but you're seeing people on social media, right, say, oh, it's definitely going to be Harris. No, it's definitely going to be Newsom. It's definitely going to be Gretchen, right? Whatever. You know, listen, anything is possible. I laid it out. It is possible, but number one, they only have a couple of weeks to do it at this point. And number two, unless he himself, Biden, says no, it just doesn't seem very likely. It really seems more like a fantasy than people are thinking it is. I think most people out there are thinking it's a very realistic shot. And I think I think it's that. You know what I mean? If you look at the law and the process, the rules here, right? What do you have to do? It's not quite as easy and done as readily as you might think.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So yeah, I think people are gonna have to have a conversation about policy. It's really what this has to be. You know, what kind of country do you want? And a lot of people are on one side or the other, but that's what we got. You know what I mean? We have candidates who are both up there in age and, you know, have their flaws in different areas, but they both represent, I think, a very different vision. And so it's going to come down to the vision, you know. And Jay, I think you also have a good point when you say the dust has settled maybe in some ways on this, because if you look at the numbers, they're starting to stabilize a little bit more, right? I think right after that debate, you saw kind of a panic, right? And some shifts happen right away. Now it seems like they're starting to stabilize. I saw an article earlier that said the dynamics of the race are basically back to where they were before the debate. You know, as of today, I believe Biden just retook the lead in Wisconsin in the polling averages. And so whatever kind of shock happened after that debate, it seems to have subsided. And a few months is an eternity in politics, right? A lot will happen in the country between now and November. You know, a lot. For example, someone didn't quite believe this was going to have an effect, but any little thing don't forget, this race is very close, right? And so any little thing can have a major impact. A big one could be a ceasefire in Gaza. Because again, a lot of people are anti-Biden because of what's going on there. They think he's too on Israel or whatever. And so if you were to get that ceasefire, that can move the needle, right? And even if it moves by a couple of points, that makes a big difference in some of these states. And so any little thing that happens globally or in the US can drastically shape the dynamics going forward.
Right. And on top of that, there is another debate scheduled. You know, Biden's got a lot on his shoulders for that debate. If he comes with the same type of performance, you know, I think it's going to renew some of these calls again. But he's going to really have to show and prove between now and the convention to allay some of these fears.
Right, because they're still saying that he should not pursue, that he should just drop out of the race. I've seen that kind of earlier today.
You know, they're shooting themselves in the foot by saying that, though, because what happens when the pipe dream doesn't come true, and he doesn't? Now all these Democrats, where are they left? What are they going to say? We misspoke.
Uh-huh.
Back then we thought he should, but now we think he should stay. I mean, they can't keep saying it. At a certain point, he's the nominee, right? Are they going to go
Right.
with the nominee or
Uh-huh.
not? What are they going to do? I mean, it almost seems self-defeating to be putting that out there.
Right, exactly. They're
Yeah.
basically working against what they want the outcome they want to happen, and that's to
Uh-huh.
keep the office,
Right,
and make sure that Trump and Project 2025 never come to fruition. You're gonna have to weigh these options. Look at what you're dealing with, and stop working against this situation. I think in many ways, though, at the same time there were all these calls for him to step down, it also seemed to have galvanized a lot of not Republicans, Democrats to rally to Biden as well to say,
right,
look, we've got more pressing things to deal with here. Yeah, he had a bad night, but look at
Uh,
what we're faced with here. We're faced with this corrupt Supreme Court. We're faced with the Project 2025 ideology. We're faced with an opponent that's got 34 felony convictions. What do we want for the country? And this is where we're going to go with. So in some cases, it has been a little bit of a rallying cry for Biden.
right.
And just came out, what, within the last hour, the White House doctor finally spoke in regards to his visits to the White House, because people have been speculating, because he'd
uh-huh.
went there several times, and just confirmed that there was, Biden had no sort of Parkinson's evidence or any of that.
Uh-huh.
I didn't even know that they thought he had Parkinson's. Apparently, he was checked for
Well,
Parkinson's
apparently the
time.
the the
Right.
Parkinson's the specialist had visited the White House 8 times in 8 months, and so there'd been this looming type of speculation. But within the last hour, it came out. This guy came out and released a letter giving reasons why he was there, and confirmed that
Uh-huh.
um, there was no, he has no Parkinson's stuff.
Right. So, all right. Well, we'll have to keep an eye on it. And like I said, really in
Yeah.
a few weeks, we're gonna know. This isn't like, oh, we're gonna keep convincing him for the next 3 months. It's, that's not a thing. This
All
process is
right.
finalized.